July 1944, somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy, German soldiers pressed themselves into the mud at the bottom of their foxholes, hands clamped over their ears. The ground shook beneath them as American artillery shells screamed overhead, one after another, exploding in bursts that sent dirt and shrapnel raining down on their positions. Many had survived years on the Eastern Front. They had fought the British in the deserts of North Africa, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for this. The shells kept coming. Not one battery, not two. It seemed like every gun in the American army was firing at once. The explosions blurred together into a continuous roar that made thought impossible. German veterans who survived these barrages would later describe the sensation of dirt filling their mouths, smoke burning their eyes, and the screams of wounded comrades barely audible above the thunder. What terrified them most was not the shells themselves. It was what had come before them. The crackle of an American radio, a calm voice speaking English, and then, within minutes, the sky would fall. They had been told the Americans were soft, spoiled children of a wealthy nation who had never known real hardship. Their officers had assured them that these soldiers from across the Atlantic would break at the first sign of serious resistance. The propaganda films had shown fat businessmen counting money, not warriors. They had believed it, but the men trying to kill them now were nothing like those films had promised. This is the story of what German soldiers actually noticed about American infantry weapons in combat during World War II, not the propaganda that Nazi leaders fed their troops, not the myths that grew in the decades after the war ended, but the real observations, recorded in interrogation reports, captured in private letters home, spoken candidly among prisoners who did not know their conversations were being monitored by hidden microphones. It is a story that spans 3 years and 3 continents, a story of how professional military contempt transformed into grudging respect, and finally into resigned acknowledgment that they faced something unprecedented. Not just a rifle or a machine gun, but an entire system of warfare that their tactical excellence could not overcome. The German soldier of 1942 was, by almost any military measure, among the most formidable fighting men in the world. He came from a military tradition stretching back to Frederick the Great. His training emphasized small unit initiative through a doctrine called Auftragstaktik, which gave junior leaders the authority to make decisions and seize opportunities without waiting for detailed orders from above. His rifle squad was organized around the machine gun, specifically the MG-34, and later the deadly MG-42, that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. That rate of fire was so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous tearing sound. American soldiers would come to call it Hitler's buzzsaw. The standard German infantryman carried the Karabiner 98K, a bolt-action rifle with a 5-round internal magazine. It was accurate, reliable, and robust. But it required the soldier to work the bolt manually between each shot, limiting his rate of fire to perhaps 10 or 15 aimed rounds per minute. This was considered acceptable because German doctrine did not depend on the rifleman for fire superiority. That was the machine gun's job. The rifleman existed to protect the machine gun team, carry ammunition, and close with the enemy once suppressive fire had pinned them in place. This doctrine had worked brilliantly across Poland, France, the Low Countries, and deep into the Soviet Union. By the time the first American ground forces arrived in North Africa in November 1942, the Wehrmacht had conquered most of Europe. German soldiers had defeated the French army in a campaign lasting just 6 weeks. They had pushed the British Expeditionary Force off the continent at Dunkirk. They had encircled and captured millions of Soviet soldiers in the great battles of 1941. These were men who had seen victory after victory. They had every reason to believe in their own superiority, and the Americans they were about to face. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger. The United States Army of 1942 was still finding its footing. In 1939, it had ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than the Army of Romania. The rapid expansion following Pearl Harbor had created divisions filled with young men who had been civilians mere months before. Their officers were learning their jobs on the fly, often promoted far faster than peacetime standards would have allowed. Their equipment remained largely untested in combat against a first-rate opponent. German intelligence reports described the Americans as an unknown quantity, a force that might collapse quickly under pressure or might prove surprisingly resilient. There was genuine uncertainty in these assessments. But there was also an undercurrent of confidence, even arrogance. How could these rich, soft Americans match soldiers who had proven themselves across half a continent? The answer seemed to come in February 1943, in the mountains of Tunisia. The Battle of Kasserine Pass became the first major engagement between American and German ground forces in the European theatre of World War II. For the Americans, it was a disaster that would echo through the rest of the war. The inexperienced Second Corps was spread too thin across difficult terrain, its units positioned without adequate reconnaissance or coordination. Its commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had lost the confidence of his subordinates through erratic orders and a bizarre obsession with building an elaborate underground headquarters far from the front lines. When Rommel's Afrika Korps launched their assault, the American defenses crumbled. German panzers punched through American lines with practiced efficiency. Infantry fled in panic, abandoning equipment and positions. In 2 days of fighting, the Americans lost more than 6,000 casualties. They lost nearly 200 tanks. They lost over 100 half-tracks. They lost more than 200 artillery pieces. They lost 500 trucks. Entire battalions ceased to exist as fighting formations. German commanders watched these events with satisfaction that bordered on open contempt. German officers had predicted before the battle that American soldiers were physically soft, that their officers were incompetent, and that they would not fight when pressed. Kasserine seemed to validate these assessments. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself, in his personal notes written during the campaign, described the Americans in harsh terms that reflected the prevailing German contempt. But Rommel, unlike many of his subordinates, added a qualification that would prove far more significant than his initial harsh assessment. He noted that the Americans had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and that their equipment and logistics were formidable. He had seen something that others had missed or dismissed. The Desert Fox had glimpsed the future, even if he did not yet fully understand what it would mean. German soldiers and officers at Kasserine captured significant quantities of American weapons and equipment. They examined M1 Garand rifles with their unusual 8-round en-bloc clips. They inspected Thompson submachine guns with their distinctive drum magazines. They catalogued M1 Carbines, Browning automatic rifles, and the curious rocket launchers the Americans called Bazookas. Their assessments during this period reflected their battlefield success. The weapons were interesting, certainly, well manufactured, but nothing that should trouble the Wehrmacht. 5 weeks after Kasserine, everything changed. The Battle of El Guettar, in late March 1943, saw many of the same American units face the same German formations they had fled from weeks earlier. But this time, under the new command of General George Patton, the outcome was dramatically different. When 50 panzers from the 10th Panzer Division attacked American positions expecting another easy victory, they ran into something unexpected. Coordinated artillery fire began falling on them almost immediately, the shells bursting with uncomfortable accuracy. Carefully placed minefields channeled their advance into killing zones, and the American infantry, the same soldiers who had fled at Kasserine, refused to break. They held their positions and kept fighting. 30 of the 50 attacking tanks were destroyed. The German advance stalled completely. Counterattacks failed. For the first time in North Africa, American forces had stopped a major German armoured assault cold. Surviving German war diaries from this period recorded surprise at the unexpected ferocity of American resistance. The tone stood in striking contrast to earlier entries, dismissing American troops as green and unreliable after Kasserine. Something had changed in just 5 weeks. Something fundamental. The Americans had learned. This capacity for rapid institutional learning would become one of the defining characteristics of the American military in World War II. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the German army, where admitting failure could damage careers and where junior officers hesitated to deliver bad news upward, the American system actively encouraged honest after-action reports and quick adaptation. The disaster at Kasserine forced a complete re-evaluation of American training, tactics, equipment, and leadership. Commanders who had failed were removed without sentiment. New tactical doctrines were developed based on what had actually happened, rather than what should have happened. Infantry and armour coordination improved dramatically. Artillery procedures were refined. Within weeks, the same army that had fled at Kasserine was fighting with a professionalism that genuinely surprised its enemies. But what specifically did German soldiers actually think about the weapons those Americans carried? The interrogation reports, captured documents, and covertly recorded conversations provide detailed answers. The single American infantry weapon that drew the most consistent German attention was the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle. This attention was deserved. The Garand represented a fundamental shift in infantry firepower that the standard German Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifle simply could not match on an individual basis. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. A trained American rifleman with an M1 Garand could deliver 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute at effective combat ranges. His German counterpart, working the bolt of his rifle between each shot, managed roughly 10 to 15 rounds in the same time. This meant that an American rifle squad could generate a volume of fire that sounded to defenders like they were facing a much larger force. Multiple accounts from the later Normandy campaign describe German units believing they faced an entire American company when they were actually engaging a single reinforced platoon. The sheer volume of semi-automatic fire from those 8-round clips created an acoustic and tactical signature that resembled sustained machine gun fire rather than individual rifle shots. German defenders reported what seemed like entire automatic weapons squads engaging them, when in fact they faced ordinary riflemen with semi-automatic capability. The Germans responded to this challenge in a way that reveals their true professional assessment of the Garand. They tried to match it. The Gewehr 43 was a German semi-automatic rifle that emerged directly from frontline demands for a weapon with comparable range and hitting power to what the Americans and Soviets were fielding. The design was influenced by both the M1 Garand and the Soviet SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle. But the Gewehr 43 proved problematic in service. It was heavier than the Garand. It was less reliable, particularly in the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. It was more complex to manufacture and maintain. Only about 400,000 were produced compared to more than 5 million M1 Garands manufactured during the war years. Some German soldiers actually preferred captured Garands to their own Gewehr 43, despite the obvious logistical problems of obtaining American .30 caliber ammunition. That preference speaks louder than any official assessment. The second German response to American semi-automatic firepower was even more significant for the future of infantry combat. The Sturmgewehr 44, known during development as the MP-43 and MP-44 before Hitler personally renamed it, became the world's first true assault rifle to see widespread combat use. It fired an intermediate power cartridge from 30-round detachable magazines, giving individual soldiers automatic fire capability with manageable recoil. While the development of the Sturmgewehr was driven primarily by Eastern Front combat experience and German studies showing that most infantry engagements occurred at distances under 300 meters, the American semi-automatic advantage was part of the calculation. German weapons designers and tactical planners understood that the age of the bolt-action rifle as the primary infantry weapon was ending. The future belonged to weapons that could generate high volumes of aimed fire from individual soldiers. There is a persistent myth about the M1 Garand that deserves examination. The rifle made a distinctive metallic ping sound when its empty 8-round clip ejected after the last shot was fired. Popular legend holds that German soldiers listened carefully for this sound and immediately attacked during the brief moment when the American rifleman was vulnerable while reloading. Robert Bell, an M1 Garand armorer for the civilian marksmanship program, who spent years personally interviewing German World War II veterans, reported their unanimous response to questions about this supposed tactic. They said that in actual combat conditions, with rifles firing from multiple directions, machine guns chattering, artillery and mortars exploding, grenades detonating, men shouting and screaming, with their hearing already damaged from months or years of combat, they never listened for that ping. The battlefield was simply too loud. The myth makes for a compelling story, but the men who were supposedly exploiting this vulnerability said it was simply not true. Yet German veterans did not simply worship the Garand or consider it the perfect infantry weapon. Their assessment was more sophisticated than uncritical admiration. German squad doctrine was built around the machine gun as the primary combat element, with riflemen serving as a protective screen, ammunition bearers, and assault troops. The rest of the squad existed to support, supply, and protect the machine gun team. From this doctrinal perspective, the American emphasis on the individual rifleman as the primary source of firepower seemed misguided. German veterans acknowledged freely that the Garand was well manufactured and effective as a rifle, but they noted that American small arms were not optimized according to German ideas of infantry combat. The Americans had invested in semi-automatic rifles for individual soldiers, while the Germans had invested in machine guns for squads. Different doctrines produced different weapon choices. Neither approach was objectively wrong. They simply reflected different tactical philosophies. If the M1 Garand earned German respect, the 50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun earned something closer to dread. German veterans, who spoke with American military historians in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, consistently rated the 50 caliber Browning as the single most effective weapon in the entire American arsenal. Their reasoning was straightforward. The Germans had nothing equivalent. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized high mobility and high rate of fire, general-purpose machine guns in rifle caliber, the 7.92mm cartridge used by their MG-34 and MG-42. For anti-material roles and dealing with armored vehicles, they relied on 20mm and larger autocannons, which required vehicle mounting due to their size and weight. There was nothing in between. The M2 Browning occupied a devastating middle ground that exploited this gap. Its 50 caliber cartridge could penetrate light armor, masonry walls, sandbag emplacements, and fortified positions at ranges exceeding 1,800 meters. A burst from a 50 caliber could punch through cover that would stop rifle caliber rounds completely. Yet, unlike the heavy autocannons, the M2 was mounted on virtually every American combat vehicle. Jeeps carried them, half-tracks mounted them, tanks had them as secondary weapons. Even some trucks in supply convoys were fitted with 50 caliber mounts. This gave American forces a level of ubiquitous heavy firepower that German infantry simply could not match. Any American vehicle column might include multiple 50 caliber guns. Any American position might have one or more of these weapons covering approaches. The sheer density of heavy automatic weapons in American formations created a firepower advantage that infantry weapons alone could not overcome. German veterans who discussed the M2 acknowledged its raw destructive power, but they also offered a characteristically practical German counterpoint to American enthusiasm for the weapon. They thought their own MG-34s, and particularly the MG-42s, with their extremely high rates of fire, could punch through a basement wall or other field fortification just about as fast, and the German weapons were far easier to move around on the battlefield. When asked why mobility mattered so much, they explained that enemy troops often used burned-out homes, ruined buildings, and similar structures as makeshift fortifications. In the fluid combat that characterized much of the fighting in France and later Germany, a weapon you could carry and quickly reposition was often more valuable than a heavier weapon that required a vehicle. The Thompson submachine gun and its replacement, the M3 grease gun, also drew German attention. These weapons occupied roughly the same tactical role as the German MP40, serving as close-quarters weapons for non-commissioned officers, vehicle crews, and assault troops. The Thompson's 45 caliber round offered superior stopping power at close range compared to the MP40's 9mm cartridge. Its double-column staggered magazine feed proved more reliable than the MP40's single-feed design, which was particularly susceptible to jamming in dirty or sandy environments like those encountered in North Africa. However, the Thompson was significantly heavier at over 10 pounds compared to the MP40's approximately 9 pounds, more expensive and time-consuming to manufacture, and produced greater muzzle rise during automatic fire. Germans did not widely adopt captured Thompson submachine guns despite their quality. The primary reason was logistical. 45 caliber ammunition was incompatible with German supply chains, and scrounging enemy ammunition was unreliable at best. German forces, more commonly pressed, captured Soviet PP-41 submachine guns into service because those could be converted to accept standard MP40 magazines, solving the ammunition problem. The M1 Carbine received mixed German assessment. With more than 6 million produced during the war, it was the most manufactured American small arm of the conflict. German intelligence manuals catalogued it under the foreign equipment designation 455A. German soldiers who encountered the weapon appreciated its light weight at just over 5 pounds and its compact dimensions, which made it easy to carry and maneuver. Its semi-automatic operation provided good firepower for a weapon of its size. However, German soldiers criticized its 30 caliber carbine round for inadequate stopping power. The round delivered about half the energy of the full-power 30 caliber rifle cartridge used in the M1 Garand, though roughly twice that of pistol ammunition. Men could sometimes be hit multiple times and continue fighting, at least briefly. This complaint about stopping power echoed similar criticisms voiced by American soldiers themselves. German forces did capture and use M1 carbines on occasion. Photographic evidence from the Battle of the Bulge shows SS troops carrying captured carbines after overrunning American positions. But systematic German use was limited by the same ammunition problem that affected all captured American weapons. The 30 caliber carbine round resembled nothing the Germans manufactured, and captured ammunition supplies were never reliable. There was also a practical danger in using enemy weapons. The distinctive sound of American firearms attracted the attention and fire of troops on both sides who recognized enemy weapon signatures. German soldiers using captured American weapons risked being shot by their own comrades who heard the unfamiliar sound and assumed it came from an enemy. The Browning automatic rifle occupied a different position in German assessments. As the American infantry squad's primary automatic weapon, typically one per squad of 12 men, it was outclassed on paper by the MG42 in virtually every measurable technical category. The BAR used a 20-round box magazine versus the MG42's belt-fed system that allowed virtually unlimited sustained fire. The BAR lacked a quick change barrel, meaning it could overheat during extended firing, while the MG42 could swap a hot barrel for a cool one in under 10 seconds. The BAR's cyclic rate of fire was perhaps 550 rounds per minute versus the MG42's 1200 rounds per minute. On paper, the comparison was not even close. German veterans noted these technical shortcomings bluntly. They thought the BAR needed a quick change barrel and a faster rate of fire. They questioned why it used 20-round magazines when belts were clearly superior for sustained automatic fire. They found it strange that the Americans had not simply designed a belt-fed weapon from the start. Yet the BAR earned German respect through an indirect and grimly practical form of acknowledgment. It became a prime target for German snipers, right alongside officers, radiomen, and forward observers. The fact that German tactical doctrine specifically prioritized killing the BAR man demonstrates that they recognized and feared its contribution to American squad firepower. A rifle squad without its BAR lost a significant portion of its automatic fire capability. Taking out the BAR gunner degraded American firepower more than killing any other single rifleman in the squad. The weapon had compensating virtues that technical specifications did not capture. It was extremely reliable under field conditions. It could be completely stripped and reassembled in the field without any tools. Its robust design meant that dirt, mud, sand, and dust rarely caused the kind of jamming problems that sometimes plagued the more sophisticated MG34. It was simple enough that almost any soldier could learn to operate it effectively with minimal training. Perhaps the clearest evidence of German respect for an American infantry weapon requires no testimony or interrogation reports at all. It is simply the existence of the Panzerschreck, the German response to the American Bazooka. German forces first captured intact M1 bazookas during the Tunisian campaign in February 1943. The timing is historically significant. This was the period immediately around the Battle of Kasserine Pass, when German commanders were at the absolute peak of their contempt for American fighting ability. German soldiers had just routed American forces in one of the most lopsided defeats of the war. Yet even as they dismissed American soldiers as soft and inexperienced, even as they derided American officers as incompetent amateurs, German ordnance engineers who examined the captured bazookas recognized something genuinely revolutionary in the weapon's design. Here was a lightweight, truly man-portable weapon that an ordinary infantryman could carry and operate. It could destroy armored vehicles using a shaped charge warhead delivered by a small rocket. Nothing remotely like it existed in the German arsenal at that time. Within months, the Germans had designed and begun producing their own version. The Raketenpanzerbuchse 54, better known as the Panzerschreck, was not merely a copy of the American original. German engineers improved on the design in ways that reflected their own combat priorities and the specific enemies they faced. They scaled the caliber from 60mm to 88mm, significantly increasing armor penetration capability. This was necessary because German forces faced increasingly heavy Allied tanks, like the Sherman and later the Soviet T-34 and KV series, which had thicker armor than the early war tanks the Bazooka had been designed to defeat. They replaced the battery-powered electrical ignition system with a magneto-based mechanical one, which proved more reliable in extreme cold conditions on the Eastern Front. They added a blast shield to protect the gunner's face from the rocket motor, which, unlike the American design, continued burning after leaving the tube. Nearly 300,000 Panzerschreck launchers were manufactured during the war, along with millions of rockets. The weapon proved devastatingly effective against Allied armor, particularly in the close terrain of Normandy's hedgerows and the urban fighting in European cities. American tank crews learned to fear the weapon and its smaller cousin, the Panzerfaust. The effectiveness of the German response ultimately caused the original American bazooka to be completely redesigned after the war. The new M20 Super Bazooka featured an 89mm warhead, essentially matching the German improvement. When the Germans copied something, it meant they respected it. As the war progressed from North Africa through Sicily and Italy and finally into France, German assessments shifted focus. They talked less about individual American weapons and more about the integrated system those weapons served. At Anzio in February 1944, during the German counteroffensive called Operation Fischfang, German commanders believed they faced overwhelming Allied superiority in artillery, with some estimates suggesting ratios as high as 20-1. Whether or not that specific figure was accurate, the perception shaped German tactical decisions. When the Germans attacked, Allied artillery proved absolutely decisive in halting the assault. Guns from multiple divisions concentrated their fire on German assembly areas and attack routes. The counteroffensive collapsed under that weight of metal. Rommel, observing operations from outside Italy, wrote bleakly that the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery and air power had broken the front open. He was not making excuses for other commanders. He was stating what he believed to be military fact. By Normandy, in the summer of 1944, the transformation in German perception was complete. At Hill 192 near the town of St. Lo in early July, American artillery preparation dropped more than 20,000 rounds over the course of the day's fighting, beginning with an intense 20-minute barrage before the assault. This concentration of firepower was among the heaviest up to that point in the entire Normandy campaign. German soldiers who survived the bombardment surrendered en masse, too stunned and disoriented to continue resistance, even though they had not been physically wounded. During Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, 1,500 American heavy bombers dropped 3,300 tons of bombs on German positions as part of the breakout from the Normandy beachhead. The bombing was so intense that some American troops were killed by short rounds, and controversy surrounded the operation for months afterward. But its effect on the German defenders was catastrophic. Panzer Division Commander Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein described the aftermath in a report that survived the war. The positions of infantry and artillery were blown up. The whole bombed area was transformed into fields covered with craters in which no human being was alive. Tanks and guns were destroyed and overturned and could not be recovered because all roads and passages were blocked. His division, one of the best equipped and trained in the German army, effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Field Marshal von Kluge, who had replaced Rommel after the latter was wounded by an Allied fighter bomber, reached a stark tactical conclusion. "In the face of total enemy air superiority," he wrote, "we can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air, except to retire from the battlefield." What German soldiers came to fear most about American firepower was not any rifle or machine gun or even the bombs falling from the sky. It was the American radio. The crackle of an American walkie-talkie meant that overwhelming artillery was about to rain death on their positions. American forward observers accompanied infantry units at the company and battalion level, equipped with radios that connected them to fire direction centers. Those centers could calculate firing data for multiple artillery battalions and coordinate their fire onto a single target. The system could mass the guns of an entire division, sometimes multiple divisions, onto one map grid square within minutes of a request. American spotting aircraft, small L-4 grasshoppers that seemed to be everywhere above the battlefield, added an additional layer of observation. German troops learned that if a grasshopper appeared overhead and began circling, artillery would follow within minutes. There was no place to hide from eyes in the sky connected to guns miles behind the front line. The coordination techniques Americans used, including the so-called time-on-target method, that calculated different firing data for each battery, so that shells from guns at different distances would all arrive simultaneously, created an effect on the receiving end that was psychologically devastating. There was no warning build-up of fire, silence, and then suddenly everything exploded at once. Every American rifle squad, in effect, had the entire weight of divisional and corps artillery available on request. The German army never developed a comparable system. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 brought one final technological shock that shattered what remained of German morale regarding American weapons. It involved something no ordinary soldier could see. The VT proximity fuse was a weapon so secret that its development ranked in importance alongside the atomic bomb project, consuming the efforts of roughly 3% of all American physicists during the war years. The principle was simple, but executing it was extraordinarily difficult. A miniaturized radio transmitter in the nose of an artillery shell would send out a signal. When that signal bounced back from a nearby surface, indicating the shell was close to its target, it would trigger detonation. This meant artillery shells could be set to explode at the optimal height above the ground, typically 20 to 30 feet, producing an airburst effect. Shrapnel from such a burst showered downward into foxholes, trenches, and other positions that had offered protection from shells that exploded on impact or buried themselves in the ground before detonating. When proximity-fused artillery was authorized for ground combat use in late 1944, it fundamentally altered the German infantryman's calculus of survival. Traditional artillery could be survived by digging deep and staying low. Cover that stopped fragments from ground bursts became useless against fragments raining down from above. The effect on German soldiers was devastating, both physically and psychologically. Prisoner interviews described enemy troops emerging from proximity fuse barrages in a dazed, almost catatonic state. They realized they were facing a new kind of artillery, but they could understand neither how it worked nor how to evade it. At the town of Normandy during the Bulge fighting, American artillery battalions fired proximity-fused shells with such terrifying effect that some German soldiers charged directly toward American positions, screaming that they wanted to surrender, preferring captivity to enduring another moment of the air bursting shells. By late December 1944, proximity-fused artillery had killed hundreds, possibly thousands, of German soldiers in the Ardennes. In one engagement alone near Echternach, more than 700 German troops were killed by the air-bursting shells over 2 days. German commanders offered rewards for soldiers who could find an intact fuse, desperate to understand the technology that was decimating their troops. Reports from the front indicated that the effectiveness of the new shells caused some German units to refuse orders to advance. General George Patton himself wrote that the proximity fuse had won the Battle of the Bulge. He believed that when all armies eventually obtained this technology, military tactics would have to be completely reinvented. In a historical irony that underlines the technological surprise, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans captured an American ammunition dump containing thousands of proximity fuses. But German engineers and scientists had previously concluded that proximity fuses were impossible to manufacture because of the tremendous acceleration forces a shell experiences when fired from a gun. They believed no electronic components could survive such forces. When they found the American fuses, they did not recognize what they had captured. The gap between what German soldiers were told about Americans before combat and what they actually experienced became one of the war's most striking propaganda failures. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as materialistic, individualistic, and militarily weak. Money hunters, too absorbed in the pursuit of the dollar to produce a strong military force. This narrative drew on long-standing German cultural stereotypes and appeared validated by the disaster at Kasserine Pass. German soldiers going into battle against Americans expected to face soft opponents who would collapse under pressure. The reality was described by German veterans in terms that appear consistently across many post-war accounts. Americans were enthusiastic amateurs with a disposition toward aggression unlike any other nation's soldiers they had faced. While German veterans generally did not consider the individual American infantryman more skilled than his British or German counterpart in small unit tactics, they acknowledged that Americans more than compensated with sheer combat aggression. What frustrated German soldiers most was the American approach to warfare itself. Many expressed annoyance that American infantry declined to fight fairly and relied so heavily on artillery and air power to destroy resistance before ground troops advanced. American tactical doctrine used holding attacks, where one unit engaged and fixed enemy forces while massive supporting fires hammered them and flanking units maneuvered for advantage. To German soldiers steeped in traditions of infantry combat, this seemed impersonal and somehow unsporting. But it was devastatingly effective. American doctrine was specifically designed to exploit American advantages in logistics, artillery, air power, and industrial production, while minimizing American casualties. It was not designed to give the enemy a fair fight. It was designed to win. The fighter bombers, known as Jabos, short for the German word Jagdbomber, became the most visceral symbol of American air superiority. A German corporal serving in Normandy wrote simply in his diary that the Jabos were a burden on their souls. German soldiers developed bitter humor about aircraft identification. If it was camouflaged, it must be British. If it was silver, it must be American. And if you could not see any aircraft at all, they must be German. Any honest assessment of German observations about American infantry weapons must confront an uncomfortable statistical reality that complicates simple narratives. Detailed quantitative analysis by military historian Colonel Trevor Dupuy, published across multiple scholarly works in the 1970s and 80s, concluded that on a man-for-man basis, German ground soldiers consistently inflicted casualties at approximately 50% higher rate than they suffered from British and American opponents under all circumstances. This held true whether German units were attacking or defending, whether they had local numerical superiority or were outnumbered, whether they had air support or faced total enemy air dominance. Later analysis suggested that the 50% figure might be somewhat exaggerated, but still confirmed that German soldiers performed at roughly 20% higher combat effectiveness than their American counterparts in comparable tactical situations. This performance gap was not attributable to superior German weapons. German small arms were not dramatically better than American ones. The gap came from differences in training, tactical doctrine, and especially the machine gun-centric organization of German infantry squads. A German rifle company of 150 men might field 15 MG-42 machine guns. That concentration of automatic firepower could suppress an American platoon through sheer volume of fire, regardless of how many semi-automatic Garands the Americans carried. Yet German tactical superiority at the individual and small unit level was rendered strategically meaningless by American superiority in artillery, air power, logistics, communications, and above all, industrial production. The German army could win firefights and lose the war. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most capable commanders, compared leading late-war German forces to playing a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. The analogy captured the frustration of professional soldiers who knew their craft but lacked the instruments to execute it. American post-war assessments were remarkably self-critical and often echoed what German veterans had observed. American infantry officers acknowledged that the M1 Garand, while reliable, was too heavy and limited in firepower for assault operations. They concluded the BAR was also too heavy and lacked sufficient ammunition capacity to function as a true light machine gun. They explicitly stated that infantry squads needed belt-fed automatic weapons rather than magazine-fed automatic rifles. The Army even attempted to manufacture an American version of the MG-42, designated the T-24, recognizing the German weapon as technically superior to existing American machine guns. These assessments closely matched what German veterans had been saying all along. Remarkably, the transformation of German perception of American soldiers in World War II closely paralleled a nearly identical pattern from the First World War. A military intelligence document, compiled by American headquarters in 1919, collected German assessments of American troops from the earlier conflict. The chief of staff for a German army commander stated that he found the American army the most honorable of all enemies, the bravest, and the only forces who had attacked seriously during the final year of fighting. Another German officer observed that the American infantryman was reckless to the point of foolishness, seldom taking cover and even attacking machine gun positions across open ground. The pattern repeated almost exactly across both world wars. Initial dismissal of Americans as soft and materialistic, then shock at their actual combat aggression and firepower, and finally resigned recognition that tactical excellence could not overcome a nation bringing overwhelming material superiority and genuine willingness to learn from its own mistakes. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West during the Normandy campaign, identified 3 factors that defeated Germany when American intelligence officers interrogated him after the war. First, the unprecedented superiority of Allied air power, which made daytime movement virtually impossible. Second, the catastrophic shortage of motor fuel that immobilized armored formations. Third, the systematic destruction of all railway communications throughout France. He emphasized to his interrogators that the root of all German problems in the West was air power. Air power. Air power. He did not mention any specific infantry weapon, because in the end, individual weapons had not decided the campaign. The intelligence infrastructure that documented these German assessments was extensive and systematic. Much of what we know about German opinions comes from covertly recorded conversations between prisoners who did not realize they were being monitored. The Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, operated jointly by British and American intelligence, processed over 10,000 German prisoners through specially designed facilities in England. Hidden microphones recorded more than 64,000 conversations between prisoners, producing tens of thousands of pages of transcripts. These conversations, where German soldiers spoke candidly among themselves about their combat experiences, their opinions of enemy weapons, and their assessments of the war's progress, represent the most unfiltered surviving record of genuine German military opinion. On the American side, a top-secret facility at Fort Hunt in Virginia processed more than 3,000 German prisoners of war, generating over 5,000 intelligence reports using careful interrogation methods. The program known as P.O. Box 1142 remained classified for decades after the war ended. The Ritchie Boys program trained approximately 22,000 men and women in interrogation and intelligence gathering techniques. Many were German-speaking immigrants who had fled Nazi persecution and now served the American war effort by interviewing captured enemy soldiers. These interrogators conducted thousands of frontline interviews that captured German assessments while combat experiences remained fresh. After the war, the Foreign Military Studies program commissioned approximately 2,500 studies written by former senior German officers. These documents, now preserved in the National Archives, include detailed assessments of American weapons, tactics, and capabilities written by the men who had commanded German forces in combat. The studies were originally intended to help American military planners understand German methods, but they also preserve invaluable German perspectives on their American opponents. Today, in military museums across the United States and Europe, the weapons that German soldiers observed and assessed hang in display cases. The M1 Garand, with its distinctive en bloc clip, the heavy barrel of the Browning automatic rifle, the massive bulk of the .50 caliber Browning. Visitors examine them and try to imagine what it felt like to carry these weapons across the beaches of Normandy, through the deadly hedgerows, into the frozen forests of the Ardennes. But the full story cannot be displayed in a glass case. Understanding what German soldiers really noticed about American infantry weapons requires seeing not just the weapons themselves, but the entire system they served. Industrial production that manufactured weapons and ammunition in quantities Germany could never approach. A logistics network that kept those weapons supplied across thousands of miles of ocean and hundreds of miles of contested ground. Communications technology that linked forward observers to fire direction centers to gun batteries, aircraft circling overhead, watching, reporting, and striking. German soldiers who faced that system understood it better than most, because they experienced it from the receiving end. Their professional verdict was honest and ultimately resigned. Individual American weapons were generally good, but not revolutionary, with notable exceptions like the .50 caliber Browning and the semi-automatic Garand. The American infantryman was aggressive, sometimes recklessly so, but not always tactically polished compared to his German counterpart. Squad for squad, the Germans believed they were better, but no amount of tactical superiority could overcome the system they faced. The endless artillery that answered every American radio call, the aircraft that appeared whenever fighting began, the industrial capacity to absorb losses and return stronger than before. The propaganda had promised soft, spoiled Americans who would break at the first resistance. Reality delivered something entirely different. Not supermen, not invincible warriors, but ordinary soldiers backed by extraordinary resources, learning rapidly from their own mistakes, adapting constantly to enemy tactics, and bringing to bear a weight of firepower that no tactical skill could overcome. That was what German soldiers truly noticed, not just the rifles and machine guns themselves, but an entire way of war they could not match.